Hello, this is Brittany Steck, and this is my presentation answering the question, who were the Victorians? Today's presentation, I will be focusing on the educational lives of the English during the Victorian era. When was the Victorian era, you ask? I'm choosing to say that the Victorian era was between 1837 and 1901. Just like defining any historical era or movement, there are disputes about the exact start and end dates for the time period, but I'm choosing to have it coincide with the reign of Queen Victoria, who greatly influenced both societal and political influences that are pretty grand and explicit to scale, that to name the period for any other time seems superfluous. One thing that drew my attention when learning and reading about the educational lives of the Victorians, especially the middle class, was their autodidactic learning. Activities such as reading, attending lectures, and visiting museums were an encouraged and acceptable way for adults to continue their learning and to continue growing and stretching their minds. This increase in intellectual development for adults helped give middle-class Victorians the tools and knowledge to build their own destinies and to create a path of self-determination based on ability, merit, and hard work. We were moving away from relying on relation or birthright, and we, quote, were a society in which success was contingent on individual perseverance and energy, end quote. These are some of the texts that we'll be talking about today to speak on the topic of Victorian education. They are novels that we had to read in class, as well as poems, short stories, and other works featured in Household Words, a periodical published by Charles Dickens. Since we're talking about education, let's start in the first place we all think of, the classroom. Charles Dickens' serialized novel, Hard Times, provides readers with a satirical opinion on education in England during the Victorian era. Dickens introduces us to the rigid and formal Mr. Gradgrind, whose, quote, dry and dictatorial, end quote, voice leads the school day lessons for the boys and girls. The novel opens in a dull, drab classroom, which emphasizes the Victorian philosophy that classrooms should be settings that are boring, unenthusiastic, and unimaginative. This, quote, plain, bare, monotonous vault of a classroom, end quote, leaves no room for imagination, individuality, or enthusiasm for learning. So, to kind of show you this, I'd like to show you one video to kind of emphasize how Victorians were viewed. I have to switch over to YouTube here in order to show you this. So, here we go.
Desks in straight lines, hair in buns, classes of 50 writing out sums, canes for the naughty, no hugs for the sad, and for the lefties, the dunce's hat. We're Victorian, ask a historian, life for kids was rough. We're Victorian, very dinosaurian, if you think your school is tough, then pity us.
And it goes on. So, the opposite of Charles Dickens' Hard Times would be another short story that I read called Brother Mith and His Brothers. This was written by Henry Morley and published in Household Words. This is a short story about a man who experienced an unconventional German school. In this school, imagination and hearts were valued. Relationships between students and teachers were allowed to flourish, and lessons focused on principle and preparing the boys to be kind societal members, and gave them a sense that education was second to the importance of life experiences and preparing to be a kind adult. On a similar hand, The Scholar Gypsy, a poem by Matthew Arnold, features a narrator sitting in nature, contemplating, wishing, daydreaming, and talking about his experiences with a band of gypsies. This, of course, this imagination would be absolutely the disgust of of Charles Dickens's Mr. Gradgrind. These novels and poems all showcase the reality of education inside the classroom. It was like Charles Dickens described, although he's being satirical and, like all of these, critiquing that setting and those views. It also just reflects the public's poor opinion about it, that maybe this wasn't the best way. Maybe Matthew Arnold or Henry Morley are onto something, or maybe a balance between the two worlds would be a good idea. Outside of the classroom, like I said, middle-class Victorians were very autodidactic and took it to themselves to learn things. So next we're going to talk about The Woman in White and serialized readings. Serial novels were very popular during the Victorian era. These were published in short installments in weekly newspapers, magazines, and periodicals. The stories would grow little by little, and because they were in these cheap periodicals, the middle class had access to them. They were very economic, so they could branch into the literary world. One example of these serialized works was The Woman in White, which you see here by Wilkie Collins. Wilkie Collins' novels, such as my favorite, The Moonstone, focused on mysteries. The best part about the mysteries being in serialized novels was the author could only reveal bit by bit to their readers. This helped build suspense, allow tension to stretch, and it would intrigue the reader for a longer period of time. Also, Aurora Leigh, you can see that characters could be built bit by bit as well, giving them a sense of relation to the reader. In Aurora Leigh and The Woman in White, the importance of written word is emphasized. Both The Woman in White and Aurora Leigh talk about the importance of the written word through the use of letters, diary entries, personal statements. Also in Aurora Leigh, they explicitly talk about the importance of poetry and how poets are, quote, of the only truth tellers now left to God, the only speakers of essential truth. Both of these and just serialized novels in general show the importance of the written word for Victorians to be able to learn about themselves, about the people around them, and about different parts of the world, such as through travel writing and history lessons. But that, of course, is a talk for another PowerPoint. So it wasn't just men, though, or children that were learning. Now we're going to talk about wonderful and wide-eyed women, the Cranford experience. The mind and voice of the Victorian woman is inspiring as well, if not even more so. During Queen Victoria's reign, women were kept in the private sphere of the home and copied Queen Victoria in her idyllic role of mother and housewife. Being a housekeeper and mother was respected, if underappreciated, of course, as we continue to know today. But women in the Victorian era were having increased educational efforts, which, as I say here, is the key to any social advancement. Traditional feminine roles were still expected, such as using this freedom to help others. The ability to enter into the public sphere was given through volunteer work, charity work, or committee work outside of the home, which gave these Victorian women, quote, a zeal for the temporal and eternal happiness of the whole human race, end quote. They were still existing for others, but they could bring happiness to others. Ellis thinks that there's incredible power and admiration for the women of the time in this fact. She states that the woman spending her, quote, mental and moral capabilities in devising means for promoting the happiness of others, end quote, is a selfless act that deserves reward in itself. One of the novels that speaks about this pushback or this swapping of the different private and public spheres for women was Cranford. Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell features a cast of women including Miss Deborah Jenkins, Miss Maddie and Miss Jessie Brown, and more. As described on Goodreads, it is, quote, a portrait of the residents of an English country town in the mid-19th century. Through a series of vignettes, Elizabeth Gaskell portrays a community governed by old-fashioned habits and dominated by friendships between women, end quote. This novel, though satirical, provides a few pushbacks in the traditional roles assigned for women at the time. One of these, like I said, is the difference between the public and private sphere. The shift from inside to outside domestic sphere is small, but there is one instance where Miss Maddie's shop is still literally inside the home, but she's not considered a serious business competitor for the men of the town. This is after she loses all of her money with the bank. Here, Gaskell is showcasing the shifting roles of the feminine gender during the Victorian era, even if only slightly. Maddie's working position is something unprecedented in a town full of traditions and etiquette, and it is happily supported by others in the town. It gives Miss Maddie a sense of accomplishment and ownerships, which influences her pride and independence greatly. This shift perhaps reveals a growing desire for independence of women, but we have to remember that Gaskell is being satirical and poking fun of these women. Additionally, the idea of marriage is put on trial throughout the entire novel. This is revealed in several instances of Cranford ladies stating their personal opinions and distrust of matrimony, both for themselves and their fellow citizens. The role of women and the things they owe to others, especially to men, were changing during this period as they became more educated or more pronounced, which is just showcased but also critiqued in Cranford. So in conclusion, the Victorians were basically what I'd like to say is my thesis, is they were autodidactic learners with a growing interest in and understanding of the world around them, who learned through school, periodicals, museum visits, and lectures. They were also advocates for increased women's studies. So through all of the educational means that Victorians had, all of these things from the classroom to the women's experience to the serial readings that they were gaining and building and understanding themselves, I think that makes them educated and learners and curious. Thank you for watching my presentation today. Here you'll see my works cited. I have had a wonderful time this semester learning exactly who the Victorians were, which goes far beyond just their educational endeavors. Thank you.